I remember stepping off a bus in about 2006, 2007 on my first trip to New York City. It was swelteringly hot and humid, and I stepped onto the pavement and was immediately hit with three very distinct scents. One, diesel fumes from the public buses. Two was garbage that was bagged and piled in these towering mounds for collection that day. And the third was urine. The headache that I got was pretty much instantaneous. When I listen to New York City by The Men, I'm immediately transported back to that experience. The overwhelming wall of garbage, piss, and exhaust. But I will say the audible representation, when compared to the olfactory one, scent, is completely different. One with a pleasant sneer as opposed to a throbbing head. Four things I'm gonna cover here in this video. One, I'm gonna dig deeper into New York City by The Men and share my thoughts on The Men's 9th LP. Two, I'm gonna discuss its reception by referencing a few other reviews out there. Three, I'm gonna tie some of the sounds that you'll hear within this album to an underground punk trio from the other side of the country. And four, I'm gonna share my copy, which is one of the coolest pieces of wax in my collection, and one of the most limited variants. I'll start with taking a look at the critical reception. In a surprise move, Pitchfork called out The Men's 2013 LP, New Moon, as, quote, their fourth and arguably best album. This comes as a quote from writer Zach Sconfield, who penned the review for New York City, the 2023 album right here. New Moon has long been my favorite by the four-piece band, and it is in the top 5, if not top 3 records that I would list for 2013. Sconfield goes on to write, quote, to wit, New York City is the scuzziest The Men have sounded in years, an unpretentious garage punk racket that wears its analog heart on its flannel-clad sleeves. He gives the album a 7.1, which is, honestly, from Pitchfork's standpoint, nothing to scoff at. And let's pivot to another site, Spectrum Culture. In a review by Casey Burke, they write, quote, there's nothing forward-thinking here, in the context of either The Men's discography or rock in general. But what's new is the analog warmth, the titanic flair. They've sounded more scaled back and scuzzed up than this, but they've never sounded this big. I'm not entirely sure about them not ever sounding this big, but definitely I'm not sure I've heard them sound more scuzzy, something both those articles mention. So I agree with Pitchfork's Sconfield. New York City is quite possibly the best thing The Men have given us since New Moon. It's not that what followed New Moon and their 2013 LP was no good, anything but. It just didn't quite live up to that power and depth that they created on that album. Here I have to call out the Duality of The Men. On one side you have the raucous, edgy garage punk and almost like post-hardcore circa Leave Home 2011 and Open Your Heart 2012. You've got Devil's Music from 2016, which kind of saw a little bit of a return to that form. Compare that to the more rustic and nuanced alt-country tinged rockers like New Moon from 2013, Drift from 2018, where they really inject heavier keyboards, and Mercy from 2020. New York City leans definitively towards the former. It is, without a doubt, The Men's most grimy, gritty garage punk in years. Hence, where both those previous reviewers noted scuzzy. I also have to mention that I tend to have a predilection towards the latter, that more alt-country tinged sound. Mercy, I think, is an underappreciated gem, and Drift has some pretty damn solid tracks as well. But New York City gives us something entirely new, yet fully familiar at the same time. The Men leaves behind the strong keyboard and organ prominence found on Drift and Mercy in favor of the heavier guitar riffs found on Devil's Music. With exception to closing track River Flows, which gets a nod from me as the best track on the album, The Men also leave behind many of the more exploratory elements that you'll find peppered throughout their albums. Dig into Wading in Dirty Water off of Mercy for an example of this in play. Another top track nod goes to I, which features a hefty, dragging guitar riff and jeering screams. I get the impression that this album was created during a complete disenfranchisement with the state of the world. I envision hints of sarcasm conveyed through music, and through the vocals, hints of jeering, sneering contempt at the trajectory of the world in its current state. It's, frankly, absolutely brilliant. I also have to call out the Men's move from Sacred Bones. This is the first album in ages not on the Men's longtime label, Sacred Bones Records. They debuted on Sacred Bones back in 2011 with their sophomore LP, which I mentioned earlier, Leave Home. Aside from Devil's Music in 2016, which was on their own imprint, We Are the Men Records, on which they released their debut, Immaculata, back in 2010 as well, all of their studio LPs up until New York City have been on Sacred Bones. New York City is on Buzz Club Records. You'll find some powerhouses on that label. First and foremost, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Night Beats, hell, even Jesus and Mary Chain released an album there, and countless others. Let's talk a little bit about that band call out that I mentioned earlier. 3 songs in particular sound like they could almost be covers of the longtime garage punk outfit out of Portland, Oregon. I am talking, of course, of Dead Moon. It's almost like there's an ode to Fred and Tootie Cole. Fred Cole, who passed away in 2017. They have the vocal stylings, the overly simple guitar riffs that Dead Moon gave us across 10 studio albums over their near 20-year career between 1987 and 2006. The 3 songs that I mentioned include Peace of Mind, God Bless the USA, and Through the Night. In fact, I really needed to look it up to make sure that they weren't actually covers. The guitar riffs, the grating vocals, often accompanying Dead Moon's music, there's such a strong tie-in here to the stylings the Men employ throughout New York City. You just end up questioning yourself. That said, this is an album that's a much easier pill to swallow than pretty much anything by Dead Moon. The dual vocals of Fred and Tootie were great, but prolonged exposure can be likened to fingernails screeching down a chalkboard. The Men doesn't have that problem. Period. It's great. You've got tie-ins to a legendary band. Let's look at the vinyl. This, like I said, is one of the coolest pieces of wax in my collection. It's simple. Extremely simple, but very effective. This is a highly limited edition variant exclusive to Rough Trade. There were only 150 copies of this one pressed, and they're hand numbered on the back of the sleeve, with mine being number 128. Don't get me wrong, that 1 looks a little like a 7, it's actually a 1. I love the cover, this close-up of a drum kit with the vibrant gold and the Men imprinted on the kick drum. The back, too, has a great design with the track list. Big and bold, the album title in that upper right corner. And you've got images of each of the band members. I love how it's laid out. I love the design. Even the inner sleeve is great, emphasizing that kind of dual nature of the Men. But really, it's the wax that makes this such a cool piece in my collection. That swirl of black and white just looks phenomenal. I mean, take a look at that. It makes me think of oil pooling in water on the street of New York City. Despite, it being full black and white, and oil kind of tends to have this rainbow of colors. The impression so fully represents the music that you get on New York City, and kind of the dual nature of the Men. So, I gotta ask you, what do you think of New York City by the Men? How do you think it stacks up next to the band's other albums? And if you dig this, check out my coverage of New Moon right here. I talk a little bit about what it includes and why it is really up there in my top 3 albums of 2013.